US President Donald Trump did not win the 2025 Nobel Prize for Peace. He might well argue that it was not for want of trying. It certainly wasn't for want of whining. Trump's campaign for the Nobel Peace Prize has been strategically similar to that of the 6-year-old absolutely hell-bent on an Xbox for Christmas. In an irony unlikely to have amused the president, a few days after the Norwegian Nobel Committee disdained his importuning, he did wrangle what appears, for the moment at least, a genuine diplomatic triumph. A ceasefire after 2 years of war in Gaza and the return of Israeli hostages seized by Hamas on October 7, 2023, in exchange for Palestinian prisoners and detainees held by Israel. It is not the first time that a US president has heralded the dawn of peace in the Middle East. If it all unravels from here, this will not be an unprecedented occurrence either. But for the moment, at least, credit where due. President Trump may add this conflict to the lengthy list of wars he frequently claims, if frequently debatably, to have stopped. It is therefore worth considering such merits as there may be of the Donald Trump philosophy of diplomacy. It is, like pretty much everything else he has done as president, unusual. Previous US presidents, including the 4 who have won the Nobel Peace Prize, have mostly been more traditional practitioners of statecraft as a subtle, genteel chess match. Trump's approach has appeared more analogous to rock, paper, scissors. But in peacemaking more than most fields, what matters is the result, not the means by which it was achieved. How and why did Trump succeed in the Middle East? What is he doing that other US presidents didn't? And is the world's best hope right now really one man's weird obsession with a medal? This is the Foreign Desk.
Whatever you think of Donald Trump is the answer.
Diplomacy is you kick me, I punch you, and then you force them to do things to respect your interests. Remember, there are no friends, only interests.
Trump is so much building on a kind of charismatic presidency, building on his own personal ties.
You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller. Our first guest is Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for The New York Times. Stephen, let's start with the big question we're trying to address with this episode, which is that, even if we must do so through gritted teeth, do we have to acknowledge that this genuinely is a diplomatic triumph for President Trump?
Yes, I think without question. I mean, people have asked me for 2 years, how can this end? How can the killing stop? And my answer has been, whatever you think of Donald Trump is the answer. If he gets interested in it, if he puts pressure on Israel, only America can put pressure on Israel. So if Trump can corner Netanyahu, then we might have a chance of ending it.
I mean, there has been some suggestion that the deal as such is not massively different in substance from the one that President Biden was trying to float. But does that just further reinforce that the difference is Trump, that he was able to make this stick in a way that Biden was not?
Well, there are two things happening. One is it's a different time in the war, first of all. And the mounting death toll in Gaza changes the world's perception of Israel. So that's different. The second thing, which I think is actually probably as important, is this deal, at least as it's written, lets Israel keep troops in a buffer zone inside Gaza, really for the indeterminate future. Previous Biden plans and other plans did not. They called for Israel's full withdrawal from Gaza. I think this made it easier for Israel to accept.
I mean, is there any argument as well that Trump's indulgence of Netanyahu up until this point, up to and including sending American warplanes to join Israel's airstrikes directly on Iran, has helped bring the necessary conditions about?
It's hard to say. I think Iran we should separate because, I mean, in a way, Trump just came in at the very end to try to claim more credit. And in fact, though he says American bombs obliterated Iran's nuclear program, that's clearly not true. I think, and again, I'm speculating, but when Trump made it clear to Netanyahu, first during the campaign, he said, hurry up and finish the job, right? Then he came in and Witkoff pushed through an early ceasefire and an exchange. But I think in the end, what happened was Netanyahu convinced Trump, and Trump was willing to go along with the last big offensive push on Gaza City, which involved the reintroduction of thousands of Israeli troops and a real effort to retake Gaza City, and in a very strong way. The war had been kind of, frankly, stagnant for a long time, and then it picked up again. And I think in this sense, it was great diplomatic leverage on Hamas to finally agree, because if you believed Witkoff and Trump, it was Hamas who kept saying no. What got them in the end to say yes was obviously Qatar and Turkey and Egypt, but they'd been pushing. And anyway, I think personally, it was the threat of utter destruction.
I mean, it's always an open question where Trump is concerned, the degree to which there's any overarching strategy in play, or whether he is just saying things that have only recently popped into his head. But in retrospect, does any of his chat, his rhetoric about Gaza seem strategic? Even the sort of bizarre AI-generated fantasies he was posting himself of the Gaza Strip reimagined as some sort of Atlantic city on the Mediterranean?
Well, it's a very good question. I'm not sure I know the answer. It's just that one thing I think he was quite sincere about is he wanted the killing to stop. And I think he was also sincere in the end. I don't know what brought him to this realization, but that Israel was becoming increasingly isolated and America's support for Israel was becoming increasingly criticized when you had Britain and France and Canada recognizing Palestine as a state. I know it's only symbolic, it made no real difference, but it was two members of the Security Council. And I think somebody said to Trump, you know, this is really hurting us too, and maybe we should really push again to bring it to an end. But the other thing I think that mattered was Trump takes things very personally. He has good relations in Qatar. He has business interests in Qatar. His family has business interests in Qatar. And when Netanyahu bombed Qatar, without telling the Americans, I think Trump got really angry. And I think this had a lot to do with this final push, to be honest. This surprised Bibi. Now, it was very controversial in Israel also. I mean, the Israeli defense establishment was very much divided, in fact, mostly against bombing Qatar to try to kill the Hamas political leadership. And of course, it missed. But I think this was also an important motivator for Trump, who felt angry at Bibi for pushing the boundaries too far and even hurting Trump's own interests.
I mean, on the subject of Trump's own interests, one of the few fairly constant through lines of his second term has been this extraordinary, even morbid obsession with the Nobel Peace Prize and the degree to which he believes himself entitled to it. All jokes aside, does that strike you as a significant factor in igniting his determination to get involved in this?
I think so, yeah. I mean, it's a funny thing with Trump. I mean, it's like no praise is ever quite sufficient. But I do think he craves recognition and praise. There's nothing he loves more than flattery, particularly from people who he knows don't like him or who think he's not as smart as they are. He really likes that a lot, embarrassing them or proving that, in fact, he was right and they were wrong. Now, it's very hard for me to imagine all these nice Norwegian professors ever giving Trump the Nobel Peace Prize. But if the Gaza thing holds, and if it moves past the first phase, which is questionable, and moves into something serious that helps reestablish some sort of governance over Gaza that isn't Hamas and begins to rebuild. And if he does make some more progress in stopping the killing in Ukraine, I think I'd give it to him.
Well, just before the president starts enjoying this particular episode too much, we do need to address one of the possible hazards from here, which is Trump's own infamously capricious attention span. This is obviously an extremely fragile moment in Gaza, even by recent standards. How great and how dangerous from here is the difficulty that Trump, if this all gets too complicated, just loses interest?
Oh, I think it's a very serious problem. And I think I'm very pessimistic, actually, about this Gaza plan going too much farther. I mean, the idea in the end was to get the ceasefire and get the hostages and the dead hostages returned. And that was hard enough to get done. And there was no agreement from Hamas, really, to the other parts of the plan, which include the disarming of Hamas, which they say they aren't going to do, let alone their dismantling. In fact, as you've seen, ever since the ceasefire, they have been moving to reassert their local control over Gaza by attacking other clans and other dissidents. So Hamas still runs Gaza. And it's very hard to believe that any nice group of foreigners is going to come into Gaza to police Gaza as long as Hamas has all the guns. So I am pessimistic. I'm hopeful, but it will require Trump to keep pushing. And, you know, that includes pushing Israel to make some sort of steps of progress toward at least recognizing Palestinian Authority agency over Gaza, let alone any kind of independent Palestinian state, which I think is not on the cards for a generation, at least after October 7th. But, you know, I'd like to be hopeful.
That was Stephen Erlanger, Chief Diplomatic Correspondent in Europe for the New York Times. This is The Foreign Desk. You're listening to The Foreign Desk with me, Andrew Muller, and joining us now for a look at what it is like to work as a diplomat under President Trump is Brigadier General David Stilwell, former US Air Force pilot and Asia advisor to the chairman of the Joint Chiefs, who later served from 2019 to 2021 as Assistant Secretary of State for the Bureau of East Asian and Pacific Affairs during the first Trump administration. Let's start with the beginning of your work in the State Department. What appealed to you about going to work for President Trump's first administration?
I was in the Air Force up until 2015, and my last job was at the Pentagon, doing essentially the same job as I did at State for the chairman of the Joint Chiefs. So I was the deputy director for Asia at the Pentagon under the Obama administration. So I'd seen how our relationship with China, working that relationship with a different administration. Then I retired, went to Hawaii, and I was kind of watching the 2017 back and forth between U.S. and China. And when two things: when Trump refused to allow Xi Jinping to cut in front of Abe, who was received at the White House, and two, offered that he would meet with Xi Jinping, but he would do it in Florida, Mar-a-Lago. It told me everything I need to know. He knows exactly how to manage this relationship. And then the two more things: during the dinner in Mar-a-Lago, 57 Tomahawks landed on a Syrian airbase to fulfill Obama's threat, the Syrian Red Line. That was definitely intentional. That was a message Xi Jinping said, I am not afraid of taking action, and we will resolve our issues on my watch. The last thing was out of that the May 2017 Mar-a-Lago meeting came the 100-day deal, where the Trump administration realized that the PRC will sign up to trade stuff, but they won't follow through. So he gave them 100 days to get their stuff together. And when they failed to do it, I was fully expecting, as all previous had done, was them to take some notional throwaway, giving us nothing, and use that as a scalp for their belt, claiming victory while actually giving away the store. And he didn't do it. He said, no, I'm sorry, it's not working, and tariffs are going to start now. And finally, as you talk about this entire trade interaction with China, we get it backwards all the time. We talk about Trump's trade war. No. It's China's trade war. We're seeing it right now with rare earths. China has been conducting trade war with the world since at least joining the WTO in 2000, and all Trump did was respond.
So was it your view then that previous presidents had been perhaps overly deferential to China, overly concerned about its economic might and its importance to American markets?
I frame it more positively. I was in the U.S. Embassy in Beijing before I was at the Pentagon. So 2011 to 13, I was in the embassy. And from what I saw, well, two things. One, a misunderstanding of how to deal with the PRC, the Chinese culture and the government, in that taking a very kid gloves approach. When you hear the word diplomacy, you think of cocktail parties, pinkies extended, and, speaking French in niceties. Diplomacy could not be further from that, in my experience. You try to do it in a friendly basis, but very rarely, even with friends, does it come down to that. It comes down to basically transactional. The basis of diplomacy is, in fact, reciprocity. And so this relationship with China, we had approached it wrong. We had tried our best to be friendly. PRC always talks about the relationship. We want a positive relationship. And that diplomacy is not based on relationships at all. At higher levels, you can then move into that win-win attitude where the relationship matters. But mostly, diplomacy is you kick me, I punch you. And you do that until you get your opposite, whether they're friend or adversary, in a corner, and then you force them to do things to respect your interests. Remember, there are no friends, only interests.
I mean, with due acknowledgement, though, that there are costs and benefits to doing pretty much anything, have there not been significant costs as well to Trump's more pugnacious approach to China in particular? I mean, they're not buying a lot of American soybeans anymore.
Look, we were on a downward trajectory, and so there were going to be costs either way. This simply stanches the bleeding, because we were bleeding out for a while. And the PRC has very limited ability to respond, especially in the economic space. Okay, they stopped buying our soybeans, they buy Argentinian soybeans. It's a fungible market. So whoever was buying the Argentinian soybeans will eventually have to go buy the American soybeans. It's like oil. You can stop buying oil from one side and they'll just end run you going to, call it Russia, Iran, or others if they're not playing above board. So no, I'm not afraid. I think only good can come out of demonstrating to the PRC that we are going to stand firm. They haven't gotten yet to the point where they can dictate terms. It was getting close, but they haven't gotten there. And it's definitely time for us to dig in our heels, insist on fair treatment, and insist they live up to their commitments. Hong Kong being the main one, we all know, and the UK understands, right, from the joint declaration. Walking away from a 50-year agreement in 23 years, we have yet to actually hold them to account for that sort of thing. But it's the same with trade agreements. They'll sign any piece of paper, but they'll do the opposite. So I think it's absolutely time for the U.S. And you saw the Dutch just recently nationalized a Chinese company. As soon as the rest of the free world begins to resist this, the Beijing is going to have to comply. They're going to have to play ball. We have to do it as a group.
But if we broaden it out a bit, though, and look at the wider Asia region, was it made difficult for the State Department in particular to maintain policy not just with adversaries but with allies when the organization is steered by a president who is famous for impetuous, tempestuous changes of mind, at whim and apparently almost at random?
Well, sir, you can read all the negative stuff pretty much everywhere because that's generally what gets printed about Trump. So let me offer you the other perspective on that, right? One, in the first administration, for sure, there was a little sense of the madman theory where people suddenly, you gain traction and you gain respect from the other side when they're not quite sure what you're going to do. This worked really well with North Korea. That's how he got Kim Jong-un to the table. And it worked with the PRC and others. What you're describing to me is his insistence on balanced trade. It has to do with the provision of universal services, things the U.S. provides, like freedom of the seas, where people can move and ship things that we pay for, the stability in the Middle East that we, the U.S. military and others, pay for, that other countries use for free. So this balance of trade goes to a larger question of what is the U.S.'s role in the world? Will we get any help from others, or are we going to be expected to continue to bear this burden? I think the one thing that bugs President Trump the most is this idea of free riders. People who, like NATO, agreed to entry fee for a NATO membership is 2%, and they had really honestly never actually lived up to that. 1.2 for Spain, and they complain that, oh, we can't spend more on our own defense because we have welfare programs at home. Then you're not part of the NATO club. Basically, why keep pushing that to the American people? And from a security perspective, we don't have the resources anymore to police the world. And so every bomb we send to Ukraine is one less we have in the Pacific. And as the Secretary of War has said, and others have said, that's our main focus. If we're going to do anything, we need to deter any further aggression and adventure in the Pacific, because we can't afford to continue to let these things bubble up like we did in Ukraine. We've got to stop them before they, a stitch in time saves nine sort of thing.
Just finally, I want to come back to, I guess, a question of presentation, and referring to what you said earlier about that idea that diplomacy is people in nice suits speaking French to each other at fancy cocktail parties. Did you ever have any concern that President Trump's somewhat, I think we can say, abrasive personal style and the scandals attached to him damaged America's reputation on the world stage?
I don't think, and again, I'm trying to be as balanced and honest as possible. But again, from my experience in the previous administration, the fact that we generally led with weakness, and as you know, weakness breeds aggression. Nobody wants aggression in the region, and so, we looked nice, and we were very, in the word, quote, diplomatic. We said all the right things. We were very presidential, but the outcome was negative. I mean, so many bad. Look at 2022 invasion of Ukraine, 2023 invasion of Israel. It just seems that under the first administration, and now what we're seeing again in the second Trump administration, is that he has this ability through chaos, you pick whatever the technique is, to damp down this sort of aggression. We have to keep reminding ourselves that weakness breeds aggression, peace through strength, and we've got to demonstrate that strength. And we have to use our friends' strength. None better than Japan, by the way, in my area, and leveraging their capabilities along with ours, working closely with our partners, to achieve common interests. The personality quirks and all that stuff, we can talk about that. But I think they have just as much disdain for American weakness as they do maybe random or unpredictability.
That was Brigadier General David Stilwell, former Assistant Secretary of State for East Asia and Pacific Affairs. This is The Foreign Desk. This is The Foreign Desk on Monocle Radio. To note that there has never been a president like Donald Trump is to do no more than demonstrate a firm grasp of the obvious. But has he nevertheless drawn lessons from any of his predecessors? Well, joining me finally is Melanie McAllister, Professor of American Studies and International Affairs at George Washington University, and the author most recently of Promises, Then the Storm, Notes on Memory, Protest and the Israel-Gaza War. Melanie, we have a fairly broad array of former US presidents to choose from at this point, but has any previous president conducted diplomacy in any way comparable to what we've seen from President Trump?
Well, no, at one level, that's clearly the case, because Trump is so much building on a kind of charismatic presidency, building on his own personal ties and his own personal viewpoints. I mean, he's decimated the American diplomatic corps. The State Department has 50% of its ambassadors are not positioned. The State Department lower level staff is generally run by people who are interim rather than actually in their positions. Diplomats who are overseas feel marginalized and not attended to, which is correct. And there's a pervasive fear throughout the State Department that they can't say what they think, that they aren't being listened to. I can see some links to earlier presidents, however. The person I thought of first, weirdly, was Richard Nixon. And the reason I say weirdly is because Trump is really, whatever you think about him, a very charismatic person. Nixon was an anti-charismatic person, like they have nothing in common in terms of how they present. But Nixon did something very surprising, which was the opening to China in 1972. He did it from the top up. I mean, he and Kissinger basically arranged it, and then he went to China. People did not expect him, because he was a Cold Warrior, to be the person to create the opening to China, but he did it. And in some ways, for reasons not that dissimilar to why Trump decided to make this move in the Israel-Gaza war, which is to say he wanted to present his presidency as having made an important breakthrough. He had decided that the cost of the Cold War, certainly with China, had outlived its usefulness in terms of his domestic politics or in terms of things that were going on internationally, because the Vietnam War was over, the Korean War was over. The Vietnam War was almost over when Nixon went to China. So I think when we think about what Trump did, we can think about it as his deciding that both he and the two parties could afford to see this war end. In fact, they needed to see the war end. And he was willing to put pressure on Netanyahu because it was his assessment, and I think he was right, that any advantage of being pro-Israel in this war had begun to dissipate as the world turned against Israel. Also, he likes a deal. I mean, that's just Trump. We know that. He really does like to make a deal. He likes to feel like he can negotiate people into positions they didn't want to be in. That's his self-image. That's what he does. And there were also pressures from the Arab states and Turkey for Hamas to be willing to make a compromise. So we have this moment where a lot of things are coming together, and Trump is willing to go in there and push Israel a little bit. I mean, not a lot, but push Israel a little bit to get this deal. And so in that sense, he reminds me a little bit of Nixon.
Is there also, where Nixon's concerned, and you make the comparison of Nixon's outreach to China and going and dealing with Mao Zedong in person, this idea that diplomacy should be something conducted by the president as opposed to diplomacy being something basically conducted by the State Department and by diplomats, at the end of which the president turns up and shakes everyone's hand?
Yes. I mean, in some sense, that is true here, too. Of course, it was diplomats and Steve Witkoff and all sorts of negotiators who were doing the deal. But yes, in the case of Nixon, he had Kissinger. So we always, when we think about Nixon's foreign policy, we also have to think of Nixon Kissinger's foreign policy. But definitely the sense that this is a top-down diplomatic initiative, that the president is deciding the terms, essentially, and that other people are, expected to get in line. So Marco Rubio did not play a significant role in this negotiation, from what I have seen, or in deciding that it should happen. So even the people who go to do the negotiation are not representing the State Department; they're representing Trump, right? They're his ambassadors. They're Jared Kushner and Stephen Witkoff. So in that sense, it's definitely, again, very Trumpian style, taking control personally of the apparatus of the state and skipping over the normal apparatus that we would see through the State Department. I mean, the other example that I can think of in some sense is Theodore Roosevelt, who also had this kind of charismatic presidency, who negotiated the Panama separation from Colombia in the early 20th century in order for the U.S. to build the Panama Canal. And so doing things that are kind of big level interventions for the sake of a deal is not unheard of. But Trump's way of doing it is pretty distinctive because it has come on the heels of such complete disparagement of the diplomatic apparatus.
Further to the comparison with Teddy Roosevelt, and I can absolutely see the linkage between the charismatic statesman who wished to have himself seen as the embodiment of the state and so on. But Trump also does appear to share with Roosevelt, well, to an extent at least, an aversion to actual open warfare. Trump has never seemed all that actually keen on violence. So can we say that there is a linkage between Teddy Roosevelt saying, speak softly and carry a big stick, to Trump's speaking very, very loudly and carrying a big stick?
That's a very interesting point. Teddy Roosevelt was not at all averse to violence in the 1898 Philippines War.
Indeed.
He brought his Rough Riders, led them up a hill, made a big deal out of his role as a kind of tough military leader. But I think you're quite right that people often forget, especially people who didn't support Trump, that he ran on an anti-war platform. And when he was talking about American foreign policy, he talked about the problem with the endless wars since the global war on terror. He told his people that he was going to get us out of all these wars. He's been bragging that he's already ended 7 wars, and nobody knows what that means. But the fact is that he says that he ends war, that he's against war, that he was against the expansion of American power in the Middle East. And I think that we have to take that seriously, that when Trump talks about make America great again. He does have a strong isolationist tendency. He's not interested in war. He's also not interested in multilateralism. Both are true. And I think we have to take that quite seriously, that he and J.D. Vance ran on an anti-war platform. J.D. Vance described U.S. policy in the Middle East as 25 years of idiotic foreign policy. And so when we think about that, we need to think about the fact that many of the people who voted for Trump, many of Trump's strongest areas of support are in the South and the parts of the Southwest that are very strong Trump supporting areas. And those areas are also the areas where Americans are overrepresented in the military. It's almost a complete map. And the overrepresentation of Americans in the military from the South and the Southwest, from Black communities, from poor white communities, says something about the fact that those are the communities that have been fighting these wars, that have suffered from them, and that have tended to be less interested, less clear on why the U.S. should be spending this kind of money, this kind of treasure in lives and material on foreign wars. And so in that sense, I think you're exactly right.
Just as a final question, and maybe an attempt to sum it up, I mean, I think probably most US presidents who've gone out into the world and attempted to influence it have prided themselves on their mastery of the detail, of the nuance, of the history and the context. Trump almost seems to pride himself on the opposite. He's uninterested in all that stuff. Is it arguable that in certain circumstances that could be an advantage? I guess what I'm trying to do here is bringing it back to where we started with this program in the Middle East.
It's an interesting question. I think Trump does, in general, position himself as someone who doesn't do detail or nuance. But in this case, I think we need to recognize that he actually does know a certain amount of things very much from the pro-Israeli perspective. Mm-hmm. He sees himself as negotiating from a pro-Israel perspective. It's very telling that when the hostages started being released, he said, "We got our hostages home." So clearly, we and our hostages is speaking about his close alliance with Israel. He doesn't know or doesn't care that much about the history or the details. It's true, but he has made his choices clear. And his choices are that he is going to try to get Israel to negotiate, but from a position that does not compromise Israel's fundamental arguments about what it needs. So this deal definitely is very welcome for everybody who wants to see the hostages home and the Palestinians not being bombed every day and the loss of life and the humanitarian crisis there. But the stage 2, stage 3 of the deal, again, no details were worked out. It's been very typical. But those stages don't look to me like they're going to get us much of anywhere. I would love it if I was wrong. And so in that sense, the lack of attention to the detail may be the thing that ultimately ends this process.
Professor Melanie McAllister, thank you for joining us. Professor McAllister's new book, Promises, Then the Storm, Notes on Memory, Protest and the Israel-Gaza War is out now. That's it for this episode of The Foreign Desk. We'll be back next week, and look out for The Foreign Desk Explainer, available every Wednesday. The Foreign Desk was produced by Anita Riota and Lily Austin. Lily also produces The Foreign Desk Explainer. To contact the Foreign Desk team, you can email Anita at aer@monocle.com. And don't forget to subscribe to Monocle magazine and our free daily email bulletins by heading to our website at monocle.com. From me, Andrew Muller, thank you very much for listening. Until next time, goodbye.